Today we're going to be dusting off an old project and freshening it up a little bit. A few years ago I made this Regency style Pelisse for a local costume event, and I was in a bit of a time crunch at the time. I didn't have time to really finish it in the way that I wanted to. I didn't have time to do all of the trim that I wanted to, and I never was quite happy with it. It was wearable for what I needed it to do, but I'd really like to revisit it and try to see if I can get it to the point that I'd wanted to originally. My original inspiration for this project was this gorgeous Spencer that's in the Met Museum collection. It has all of this really incredible trim that's made out of the same fabric as the jacket is, and I just think it's so beautiful. And on mine I had to end up using some ribbon and buttons and things that were already in my stash that contrasted nicely but just didn't have quite the same look to it. So what I'd like to do is take it apart just as much as I need to get at all the trim, take off what's on there, and see what I can do with the leftover fabric I had from making this project, and see if we can spiff it up. I'd also like to fix the collar a little bit because it's doing something weird at the back of the neck where it's sticking out, and if we're taking it apart, might as well fix those couple of small things. It's very lucky that I happen to hang on to the rest of the fabric. Always save your leftover scraps, you will never know when you need them. I started by removing all the closures, buttons, sleeves, and the skirt so I could easily work with the bodice. I was careful to save any small pieces I pulled off in a jar so I wouldn't lose them. Okay, I have all my pieces separated out, and now we start making new trim. I was going to remove these ribbon pieces, but the new trim I want to do has a similar placement, so actually I'm just going to leave them and use that as guidelines to put my new trim on top of. Ta-da! To figure out how much rouleau trim I would need to make, I drew out the design I wanted on my paper pattern and then used a piece of string to measure how much yardage was needed. I made a few extra inches in case I was off by a bit. Next, I measured how many strips I would need for the sleeve puffs, taking my measurements off of the old ones. I added some length to these so that they will hopefully fit around my arms a little better. Luckily, I held on to the rest of the fabric from the last time I did this project, and I have two pieces about this size to work with. And I'm hoping that should be enough to do all the trim, because this was a curtain from the thrift store and I can't get any more of it. So here's the trim plan. We're going to make 3 yards of wide strips and 2 yards of narrow strips for the sleeves, 9 yards of rouleau tubes, and 8 yards of piping for the bodice trim, 8 tabs for the front, 13 fabric covered buttons, and a new collar. Now it's time to cut all of that out. I did my best to lay out pieces to make the best use of my limited fabric and cut all the long strips and bias pieces in large chunks. Self-fabric trim takes up a surprising amount of fabric.
Okay, so I got all the pieces cut out. We've got the new collar, new trim pieces for the front. These will be the sleeve trim. This is all going to be piping, and this is more piping. Oh boy. I started by prepping my piping, which I used to outline each of my tabs on the front of the bodice. I sewed the piping around by machine, trimmed away the excess seam allowance, and pressed the edges under with an iron. I then pinned each of these onto the front of the bodice, lining them up using the old ribbon that is still in place. I sewed each on by machine by stitching in the ditch between the tab and the piping. The piping helps to hide the machine stitching and get them sewn on faster than if I did it by hand. Next, I prepped the rouleau tubes. I again folded my bias strips in half and stitched them at 1/4 of an inch. I used a tube turner to turn them, which makes it actually go quite quickly. These work by basically scrunching all of your fabric down over the tool and using the little hook to grab the other end of your tube and pull it back through. I was able to make 9 yards of tubes in a fairly short amount of time thanks to my handy-dandy tube turner. I bought mine in the garment district, but you can find them online. I will put a link below if you are interested in getting one. I did my best to pin the tubes in place according to the design I had planned earlier. This will hold them steady enough while I do my best to invisibly stitch them on, making diagonal stitches through the underside of the tube. I was also careful to keep the seam of the tube facing down so it wouldn't be visible. I waited to trim the end of each piece until it was almost all sewn on in case I needed to make any adjustments as I went and to prevent wasting any of it. I used my needle to poke the ends of the tube inside itself and then stitch it shut. I repeated this process between each of the tabs until my entire front design was complete. The last bit to prepare for the front of the bodice is the buttons. I used a covered button kit that I purchased from Etsy. All you need to do is cut circles using the guide piece. Place your fabric and button front into the mold, arrange the fabric neatly into the middle, place the button back piece on, and squash it all in. Voila! Button. I put one button on the end of each front tab for decoration. I next repeated the rouleau tube process on the back of the bodice, except this time I did trace the design using tracing paper from my paper pattern, as I wanted to be sure that this was absolutely symmetrical. And I didn't really have much in place already to help with my tube placement. After patterning a new collar, I cut it out in both a light cotton and a stiff interfacing. I'm hoping adding these extra layers will help to fix my previous floppy collar issue by giving it a little more structure. My interfacing wasn't fusible, so I sewed it down to the inner lining before flatlining this piece to my fashion fabric. Lastly, I sewed piping along the edge before bagging it out with the lining. I also sewed more rouleau trim on the collar, but I won't bore you with even more footage of tubes. To make the strips for the sleeve puffs, I folded my strips in half and sewed cording into the fold. Next I unfolded my strip and sewed bias piping to one other side. Now, when I fold it back in half and turn half-inch seam allowances in, it will be finished with cording on both sides. I pinned that in place and stitched it in the ditch by the cording to finish off the edges. Using my old sleeve pieces as a general guide, I cut strips out to make my new puffs. I cut them a little longer than the originals, so I will hopefully get a fuller puff. For each sleeve, I cut one long piece to go around my arm, and 7 shorter strips for the vertical pieces. These I lined up in a general arched shape, generally like the shape of a sleeve cap, and stitched them inside the long band. I then took my narrow strip, made the same way as the wider one, and cut it in half. I wound each half around the long band, one wrap between each vertical piece. This is my best approximation of how the sleeves on the original jacket were done, and I tacked these in place to keep them from unraveling. I decided to baste the puffs and the sleeves in place and try it on now to check the fit before stitching anything down in case I need to make adjustments. Okay, so here's all the changes I made to the sleeve puff. I ended up removing one of these because it was just in my armpit, and I shortened some of them, so I'm going to copy this mirrored on the other side for the other sleeve, and then sew these into a little loop and start putting the sleeves back in. I pinned the ends of the puff strips into the arm's eye first and stitched them in by machine. Now when I go to put my sleeve in, the puff will be already securely in place on the outside of the sleeve. Lastly, I reattached my hooks and eyes to the front and sewed the skirt back on. This time, I also hand-sewed a grosgrain ribbon in a matching color over the seam allowance at the waist to make the inside even prettier. I'm really happy with how the new trim came out. It took a really long time, as much of it had to be done by hand, but looking at the final result, it feels so worth it. Making new garments is always lots of fun, but I really enjoy coming back to some of my old pieces and giving them some new life. My garments are never truly done the first time I wear them, as there was always some fine-tuning, readjustments, and sometimes entirely new trim to make the piece exactly what I had envisioned. I hope you found this helpful if you are also in the Regency outerwear trimming boat, or if not, that you enjoyed coming along for the ride anyway. Thanks for watching!